President's Office, and we're really, really happy to be able to bring you this training session on special issues around conflicts of interest for community boards. And our presenter today is Alex Kipp, who is the director of the Conflicts of Interest Board. He's the director of education and engagement. So this morning he's going to engage and educate you on everything you want to know about your relationship to the conflicts of interest law in terms of your service on the board. So we're going to ask that you, if you can all find the Q&A section, that you type in any questions that you have during Alex's presentation, and he will address them at the end of the presentation. Okay, so with that, I'll turn it over to Alex Kipp. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Adele, and thanks, Elka, for organizing this today. And thanks, everybody, for being here in our kind of virtual training session. My name's Alex. I'm from the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board. That's the agency that administers and enforces, and most importantly, gives advice about how to comply with the New York City Conflict of Interest law. I happen to be the Director of Education and Engagement. That's not important. What's more important is what's below that, which is the telephone number, which you'll see if this little bar goes away. But basically, that number is still good to call, reach out to us 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, when you have questions, which I assume as community board members, you probably will. The conflict of interest law is very robust when it talks about the walls that it puts in place between a regular old public servant like me, somebody who works 40 hours a week for the city, about a wall between my public duties and my private interests. Now, the conflict of interest law explicitly treats community board members differently. In some ways, a lot more loosely, because you're volunteers, you're unpaid, and you've got lots of interest in your community. That's why you were selected to be on the board. But there are some critical areas where the law does address where you can't take an official action. And most of those turn on voting, which is what we're going to spend time on today. So our website's here. We've got an FAQ on community boards, I think. We've got resources for you. We've got all kinds of stuff. But I think the most important thing probably is the telephone number, because that's how you get free advice from us. Probably the #1 service we give to all public servants, but especially community board members, is free legal advice about how to comply. Okay, enough of that. We're doing this training today. This is what we're going to go over: core functions, with a particular take on how this law applies specifically to community board members. We'll do a little on the basis and purpose, kind of the big picture stuff. We'll spend most of our time on what the law actually says about community board service, and then we'll do a recap. We'll do Q&A at the end. As we said at the beginning, the way we're going to do Q&A is we're going to cover everything in the presentation, and then we'll address your questions. But as soon as you have a question, just go to the top of the screen. You'll see a little green bar. It'll open up another bar at the top here. It'll say Q&A. You hit Q&A, and then you can address your question, and we will address them at the end. So here we go. The core function of the New York City Conflict of Interest Law, which is Chapter 68 of the New York City Charter, in case that's something you're super interested in, it makes me sound like I know what I'm talking about, really, is to create a separation between private interests and public duties. The more fancy way of saying it, which I think this is pretty much from our preamble, is the conflict of interest law is supposed to preserve and promote public integrity by helping public servants address conflicts between public duties and private interests before those conflicts become ethics violations. Now, woven into this, of course, is the understanding that all public servants are going to have private interests. It's not a crime to have a conflict of interest pop in your lap. The law merely stipulates that when a public servant encounters a conflict of interest, they take the appropriate measures as dictated by the law to separate those two things so that any public action or action we're taking at a public servant is not tinged with the penumbra of our private interests to the effect that to the extent that it saps the public's perception of integrity in that choice. That's a lot of words. So, important takeaway point from this slide is we've all got private interests, and when we've got questions about how to treat those things separately so they don't interfere with our public duties, we give advice. Okay, now, we all have private interests. I've got numbers. I've got many of them myself. Here are some of the ones I've had lately. Binge watching The Man in the High Castle, not bad. Binge watching the first 30 minutes of Elaine May's Ishtar, incredible 30 minutes. Binge watching the last 30 minutes of Star Wars Rogue One, also very good for different reasons. Waiting for deliveries, reading articles about home workouts, making plans to start home workouts, journaling about why I can't start my home workout. What is wrong with me? Those are my private interests. These are the private interests that generally come up when we think about the conflict of interest law. Your own financial interests, of your business, your property, your own financial bottom line, and then the financial interests of associated parties, like business partners, clients, employers, like the business you work for, your supervisor at work, or anybody who makes a supervisory decision related to your employment. If your employer is a not-for-profit, if there's a funder of your not-for-profit of over 10%, then you're associated with that person too, that entity too. If you're on a not-for-profit board, then the not-for-profit, you're associated with the not-for-profit on which you serve, where you serve on the board. And then people with whom you have financial relationships, like roommates, and then also your relatives, close relatives, like your spouses, your kids, your siblings, and then also debtors and creditors. So these are the kinds of people, these are the kinds of outside financial interests that the conflict of interest law really cares about. Let's talk a little bit now that we've sort of laid that out. We're going to talk about how the law addresses that in terms of community board service. Before we do that, I'll just mention a few things about our core functions. We've got a training unit. That's not that important for you to know about, except that's why you're having this training, because once every 2 years, everybody who's a New York City public servant, those 350,000 of us, including community board members, are supposed to have training like this once every 2 years. And when we're not conducting training, we are creating supplemental content. You can check us out on Twitter. We have a fairly robust niche Twitter following. People like it. And if you like to get jokes about ethics on your timeline, you should follow us. And then we also have a YouTube channel where we create lots of supplemental content. Some of it, if you want to know more about what that's all about, you should go to our YouTube channel. Occasionally something goes viral. But anyway, not important for this today. Here's what's important: advice. About 6,000 times a year, give or take, we are giving people one-on-one confidential advice about the conflict of interest law. Any community board member, anybody who works for the city in any way can call us up 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. You'll have a confidential conversation with an attorney whose job is to get all the facts that they need to answer the question that you're asking. It's always free. It's always confidential. Confidential means that we are not permitted by law to share your question or even the fact that you asked a question with anyone in the world, not a fellow board member, not anyone at the borough president's office, not anyone in the press, not anybody. So it's a safe place to get a question answered for free, and we'll also give it to you in writing if that is what you prefer. So just call us there, or go to our website, and there's you can email us questions as well. One caveat about advice is, of course, that when we speak about advice, we are talking about things that have not happened yet. And asking for advice about advice is for about the thing that one is proposing to do, and not the bad thing that one has already done. That's referred to in law enforcement as a confession or an admission. So we would rather speak to anyone about something they're proposing to do and not about some accidental violation that's already occurred. Now, speaking of that, how are violations handled? Well, just to give you a sense of our sort of work product, we conduct, anywhere in a non-pandemic year, we conduct around 800 classes a year and talk to around 30,000 people, hit another 30,000 online. We have about 6,000 instances of individual advice, calls, emails, written output, and then we have about 150 enforcement cases. Not very many against community board members, I'm happy to say. But there have been a few. And what happens when there's an allegation of a violation? Well, it gets confidentially investigated. The board makes a determination about whether or not to charge someone. The person, if charged, has an opportunity to respond. And then if at the end it turns out someone has violated the law, then there can be consequences to that. A civil fine of up to $25,000 for one violation, that's very rare, but occasionally has happened, not to a community board member, but we have seen big fines. And every once in a while, you will see a DA actually step in, and the conflict of interest board's enforcement process will pause or stop, and the DA will prosecute it criminally. Very rare that that happens, although, there is a gentleman in the news lately who actually, for some bizarre reasons, who was prosecuted by the Bronx DA for criminal conflict of interest violations, and that was Bernie Carrick, who was fined about $250,000 and then ended up on some related federal charges, spending some time in prison. Although that was not for the conflict of interest, the law violations, that was for some federal corruption charges, which I think, given the environment we're in now, I don't know would have even happened. But in any case, it doesn't happen very often that you see a criminal prosecution, and probably rightly so.
Alex,
Now, yes.
sorry to interrupt. Is there any way you can go full screen on your presentation?
Let me see. Full screen. This is about as full screen as it gets. Is it not?
Okay.
Let me see if there's any setting I can do. How's that?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I'm new to this, everybody, in case you couldn't tell. Okay, friends.
Also, Alex, I noticed somebody had their hand up. I just want to restate, put your questions in the Q&A box, and they'll be answered at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, so up top, for anybody who I'm sorry, I should have addressed that hand raise. I saw just a glimpse of that. That's my fault. I apologize. Yeah, just there's a Q&A box up top here. Just hit Q&A, type in your question, and then we'll get to it at the end of the presentation. Okay, now, when we talk about conflicts of interest between public duties and private interest, the big two things that people have questions about, because there's a lot in the law about this, for a community board member, are discussions and voting. Now, the good news is the discussions part of this is super easy. When you face a conflict of interest as a board, community board member, you may always participate in the discussions. It was assumed that you were going to have private interests in the community. That's why you're on the community board. Your input is valuable, and therefore you can always participate in the discussion, even if you have a conflict where you may not vote. And voting is the primary area where the conflict of interest law affects you, although there's a couple more too that we'll spend a tiny bit of time on after we do the voting, which is going to be the majority of our time today. So now, this is very different than for a regular old city employee like me or Adele or Elka. Like, if we encounter a conflict of interest at our work where our own private interest or our relative's private interest is implicated, we can't even participate in the discussion. Example, my brother applies for a job to be an attorney at the Conflict of Interest Board. I cannot be on the hiring committee. I can't recommend him. I can't do anything related to his hiring whatsoever. Now, you community board members, if you face a conflict of interest where the board is about to vote on your business, your bar, the not-for-profit where you sit on, you can always participate in the discussions. You have to disclose that what your interest is, and then you can participate in the discussions, but you do not vote. And we're going to go through that right now. So voting is the major issue when you can't, or voting is the major issue on conflict of interest. And that law is very simple. You may not vote when you have a conflict. So the end. Yay. I'm just kidding. It's not the end. What is a conflict of interest? Okay. What is a conflict? A conflict is going to boil down to two fundamentally different ideas here. One of them is the big one, and then there's another one for those of us who work in government. Let's do the big one first, and it's the one on this slide. We have a conflict on a community board when the voting would cause a direct economic gain or mitigation of loss for ourselves or our associates. And our associates, again, are, you know, all those kinds of people like roommates, close relatives, employers, clients, a not-for-profit if we sit on the board, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and with that, we've finally explained everything we need to know, so the end. Just kidding. Let's now talk about what an associate is. Okay, so we just sort of mentioned it, but an associate is a spouse, a child, a parent, sibling, or anyone with whom I have a financial relationship. And I've put examples here. This is not an exhaustive list, but, you know, client, business partner, debtor, creditor, etc. Not-for-profit if you sit on its board. Okay, so that's what an associate is. So financial conflicts. I cannot vote when there's a direct economic gain to my own financial interests, like the property I own or the business I operate or own, or there's a direct economic gain to an associated party. Business partner, client, employer, my supervisor at my employer. If my employer is a not-for-profit, then a funder, if that funder funds over 10% of the not-for-profit where I work at. Or if I'm on the board of a not-for-profit, then the not-for-profit where I'm on the board. It's also a prospective employer. So if I'm currently in negotiations with a firm to get a job, like they've interviewed me, we're talking about it, we're negotiating, then I shouldn't be voting on an issue related to that prospective employer. And then anyone with whom I have a financial relationship, like a debtor, a creditor, a landlord, or a tenant. Okay, so these are the financial conflicts where I'm not supposed to vote. So what do you do? Now, just remember, before we do the what do you do part of this, is I can't vote when there is a direct economic gain to myself or the party with whom I am associated. Direct. So it's not a potential benefit or a attenuated benefit or a putative benefit, but a direct benefit to my own interests or my associated party's interests. And then we're going to play this out here in a sort of classic example. It wasn't always my dream to be a conflict of interest board director of education and engagement. And someday I might hang it all up. And when I do, I might just do what a man of culture such as myself would do. I'll own a tiki bar. Okay, here's my sign. Now, because I've a wealth of experience in administrative law, and I'm also a restaurateur in the neighborhood. I am now a community board member as well. I operate a tiki bar. It's takeout only currently. And the question comes up, now my liquor license application comes before the community board. I think we all know that I am not allowed to vote on my own liquor license application. That's my business. Whether or not I get the liquor license approved is going to have direct economic impact on my business. Therefore, I am going to disclose, hey, that's my bar. I'm going to discuss, I think you should approve the liquor license because yada, yada. And then I'm going to refrain from voting on my liquor license application, because it's direct to my financial interests. Now, what about someone else's bar? Well, The law is very specific here. This is the way it's written. Doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean it's the way everyone thinks it ought to be, but this is the law that we have. It says direct economic gain. So I cannot vote on my own liquor license application. Let's say somebody else wants to open a tiki bar down the street from me. That's not my bar. I am allowed to vote on their liquor license application. We have no idea what impact that's going to have on my business. It could drive more foot traffic to the street in general. Maybe my sales will go up. Maybe they'll go down. Maybe he'll steal all my customers. We have no idea. That is too indirect and hypothetical to figure out whether or not there's going to be, or it's just not direct enough in terms of the effect on my economic interests. So can't vote on my own liquor license application, but I can vote on someone else's. That's what direct means. And that's very important as a sort of guidepost about thinking where you need to refrain from voting. It's got to be direct. Other issues have come up like this, where, for example, someone votes on a, or someone asks, hey, there's going to be a upzoning or a downzoning. It's a huge upzoning, downzoning in this area where I own one apartment in one big building. Can I vote on that because it might change my property value? Well, there again, it's not direct enough to your property. It's a huge decision affecting thousands of properties, and you're a very small slice of that. That's not direct enough to you, community board member, to cause you to have to refrain from voting in that instance. Whereas, you know, a counterexample would be, I am applying for a zoning variance because I want to build another floor on my house. That is a place where obviously I could participate in discussions, because you always can, but I could not vote because that's a zoning variance about my property. Okay, now, so what do I do when it's my bar? Very simple. I've already kind of said it. Let's just review. I disclose at the top before I participate in the discussions. I say, hey, that's my bar. Then I participate in the discussions, and I can say whatever I want. You all would be crazy not to re-up this thing. I've been here forever. Look at all the great impact I've had on my community, or whatever. I don't know what you'd say, but the important point is you can participate in the discussions, because you always can. And then the third thing is I do not vote because it's a direct conflict to vote on my own financial interests. Done. Now let's go to another example, I think. Let's just see here. Yes, another example. Oh, there you go. Another example. Okay. Let's say I'm a community board member and I want to sit on the board of MoMA, obviously for my design expertise. Here, I'm not financially associated with the not-for-profit, because I think in almost every instance, you're not paid for board service to a not-for-profit. That's a practice that's generally frowned upon. So you're not, it's not a financial conflict, but you are associated with that not-for-profit. You have duties under state law, duty of loyalty, duty of care, duty of something else regulated by the state, to that not-for-profit. So you are associated with that not-for-profit. And so if something comes up that is directly related to MoMA, the board where I sit, I do exactly the same thing that I did with my bar. I disclose, hey, I'm on the MoMA board. I then am free to participate in the discussions, say whatever I like, and then I do not vote on this issue related to MoMA. Why? Because I sit on the board of MoMA. I have legal obligations to MoMA, and if the public saw that the community board member serving the community also or voted on a thing where they're also on the board, they'd be, well, isn't that person conflicted? How do I know that the vote wasn't influenced by the legal obligations to MoMA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And that's why the law says you're associated with that not-for-profit, so you just don't vote on that issue that's directly related to MoMA. Now, clarification. It's not issues that MoMA likes. When the law says that I may not vote on an issue related to MoMA because I sit on its board, that means it's a thing directly related to MoMA, not modern art in general, not education about art in general. It's about something financially affecting MoMA directly. that is the thing I have to disclose my interest. I'm free to discuss, and then I do not vote. Okay, got some questions coming in. Keep them rolling. If anybody forgot how to ask a question, you go to the top, you hit the Q&A box, and we will answer those questions at the end of the presentation. Let me just check the time. Doing pretty good. Here we go. Now let's shift to a completely other area where luckily the behavior when we face the conflict is exactly the same, but it's a different kind of reasoning, and this also may not affect that many people with whom I'm speaking today. If there's a kind of conflict of office idea that's very specific woven into the conflict of interest law about community board service. And basically what it says is, if I work for a government or a quasi-governmental agency, and there is an issue that comes up for vote, that is going to directly go to my agency. Like, let's say, for example, I'm a community board member. I also work for the Department of Transportation. We want to make a request to the Department of Transportation to get a speed bump on a specific street. Because I work for the Department of Transportation, I can always discuss, but I cannot vote on that issue. Why? Because I have duties to my government agency. And if I vote on this community board thing, again, there may be a question about whose loyalties or where my loyalty was when I was voting on that thing, because I obviously have obligations to my government employer. So the question is, who's on that list? If I work for one of these governmental agencies, then if there's a direct thing, I have to refrain from voting. It's a pretty big list. It's any federal, state, or local agency. It's also the Postal Service. It's the UN. It's SUNY. It's CUNY. It's any state or local public authority. So like the MTA, for example. And I'll give you that list in just a second. So if I work for any of those agencies, like, for example, the community board wants something from the MTA. If I'm an MTA employee, I don't vote on an issue that's going to, a request that's going to go to the MTA. And here's that exhaustive list. So I'm an employee of a city agency. That's primarily where that comes up. So for example, like, let's say I'm a DOE teacher, and now there's a thing that comes up for vote related to the, funding a public school in the neighborhood. I can't vote on that DOE issue. Even if I work at a school in a different borough, I cannot vote on a DOE issue. Same thing here. If I work for a state government agency, like let's say I work for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and now the community board wants to ask the DEC to do something, I don't vote on an issue related to the State Department of Environmental Conservation. Or in the third instance here, the community board is going to ask for something from the federal government, like the I don't know why, the National Endowment for the Arts, I guess, or something like that. Let's say. Then if I worked for the NEA, I wouldn't vote on an issue related, a request going to the NEA. And then you'll see things here like public authorities, CUNY SUNY, the UN, the post office, the charter schools, local development corporations, and then the Brooklyn Public Library and Queens Public Library. All of these would be, if I worked at those places, I don't vote on matters that go directly before those agencies where I work. So the steps are exactly the same, which is good. If I work at a government agency and the request is going directly to my government agency, then I say at the top, hey, that's my agency. Then I can participate in the discussions. The conflict of interest law does not care what you say in the discussions as long as you've disclosed what your conflict is. So you could say, you could be pro your agency, you could be against your agency. That's not an issue for Chapter 68. You can say whatever you like. Be nice about it. Parliamentary procedure. That's not Chapter 68 either. And I do not vote. Also, one other thing that you'll see in the board rules that govern this behavior is, to the extent that my agency needs a representative at the community board in any way, like let's say I work for the NYPD, and now they want a public safety, sometimes I go to these meetings and the officer comes out and says, hey, everybody, we've heard about the parked cars on 77th Street, we're working on it, whatever, right? If I'm a community board member, I can't, and I work for that NYPD, I can't be the person who represents the agency to the community board, because the idea is that I'm a community board member, so I don't represent other interests, including my government agencies or my private clients or my business associates. I don't represent those people to the extent that any of them need a representative. I never serve as their representative to the community board. I'm always wearing my community board hat. Okay. Any questions about that? Government employment, not-for-profit service, or your own financial interests and voting, or how to do it? Just hit that Q&A box up at the top. We'll keep moving. Let's just review before we keep moving. I use this kind of, it's not even mnemonic because it's so simplistic, but it's the 3Ds. This device is how I remember how to talk about this stuff. When I face a conflict, I'm going to use the 3Ds. I disclose, I then discuss, and then I don't vote. And that the order is very important. I disclose and I don't just disclose that I have a conflict, I disclose my conflict. So I don't say, hey, this liquor license application is coming on this tiki bar that I think is an awesome tiki bar. You guys ought to re-up it. I have a conflict, so I'm not going to vote on it. No. I have to say, that's my bar. And now I'll tell you how awesome the bar is and why you should re-up it. So when I disclose, I don't just say I have a conflict. I say what the conflict is. That way, the discussion is sort of transparent. People understand when they hear me talk, they understand, they have a good context for what I'm saying, and then I don't vote. Okay, so the 3Ds, disclose, discuss, do not vote. Now we're gonna move on to something different. I can't remember what's next. Chairing, okay, chairing. Conflict, I'm gonna talk about two things here. Hold on, there's one. Okay, we got one thing. Asia Badi says, this is super helpful. Thank you. Compliments are always welcome. Okay, so chairing. So chairing can mean two things: chairing the community board meeting or chairing a committee. The answers, the structure, the contours of this look pretty much the same, although there's a little bit more on chairing committees. So let's do the simple one, which is chairing a board. Or chairing a board meeting, really. Anybody can be a board chair. Now, if a matter comes up for a board chair where they have to use the 3Ds because they have a conflict, then that's what they do. At the meeting, they're going to say, hey, this issue's coming up now. I am disclosing that's my bar. Now I'm going to participate in the discussions, and then I'm not going to vote. I do not vote. But there's one extra thing about that, which is because I'm chair, and there's going to be a conflict on tonight's agenda where I know I'm going to have to use these 3Ds. I cannot chair the entire meeting. Someone else has to do that. Those of you who've been on a board meeting or two already, you know that there's a little bit of power. The chair has some ability to set the agenda, and you wouldn't want any of the choices made at that meeting to come under the penumbra that they were done because there was some, effect for favorability, blah, 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 blah. Or a question, just a question that might come up, right? We want this all to be beyond reproach in how these choices are made. So I'm still the CB chair, but at that particular meeting where I have a conflict and I know that I'm going to disclose, discuss, don't vote, somebody else is chairing that entire meeting. Now, committee chair, same thing. If something comes up at the committee, I'm going to use the 3Ds. If I'm the chair of the meeting, then I'm the chair of that committee, and something's going to come up where I use the 3Ds. I am not the chair of that committee for the entire meeting. And now here's the extra thing about committees. If I have to use the 3Ds more than 3 times in a 12-month period, then I cannot be chair of that committee. Which makes some sense, because how many times can you chair? I mean, if you have to use the 3Ds every time you're at the committee meeting, then that means you're never chair anyway. You can be on the committee, but you can't be chair of that committee. So here's an example. At my community board, there is an educator who's a longtime public servant. He's been working for the Department of Ed. It seems like we would want this guy on an education or a youth services committee. I think that's a good idea. But every time that committee talks about Department of Ed, he's going to have to use the 3Ds. Now, his input is super valuable. So we want him always to participate. We want him there to give us the discussion, right? But because it's quite likely that this committee is going to be talking about a Department of Ed thing more than 3 times in a calendar year or in a 12-month period, it's not a great fit for him to be, it's also not legal for him to be the chair of that committee. Let's do our bar example just because we'll kind of anchor it to that. If I'm a person who owns 1 bar, could I chair the committee that hears liquor license applications? Well, if the chance is in 12 months, I'm only going to have 1 liquor license come up before the committee, sounds like, yeah, I could probably be the chair of that committee. If I'm a person who owns multiple sites, bars and restaurants, and lots of liquor licenses could come before that committee, the answer would probably be different. I probably couldn't chair that committee. Okay, so that's now, this is a little, for those of you who've been around for a while, this is a little bit of a change. It used to, there was some vagary in the language earlier, you know, that said, you know, if you have to, if the committee regularly hears matters where you got to do the 3Ds, and then the question was, what does regular mean? The board has clarified that. The rule now is hard and fast. If you have to use the 3Ds more than 3 times or more in a 12-month period, you can't be chair of that committee. Okay, so, but you can be on any committee you want, and you know, a person with a lot of experience who might have to use the 3Ds in some instances could be very valuable on a committee. Okay, now, vote tabulation. Now we get into something that's sort of ancillary to the conflict of interest law, but it is important, and so while it's not technically within Chapter 68, it touches on things that are, so we're going to review here. What do you need to do business at a community board meeting? You need a quorum. When you have members participating in discussion who are conflicted, their conflicts do not affect your quorum. They are still there. They are still participating. They're just not voting. So let's do a little hypothetical here that kind of games this out here, a little example. Okay. In a quorum meeting of 26, so we just made it, right? We can do some business tonight. A matter is up for discussion and vote. And 3 community board members have conflicts of interest for various reasons. Okay, so 26 people are there. They're all participating in the discussion. There are 3 people who are not entitled to vote because of conflicts of interest, which they have disclosed before they participated in the discussions, just to reinforce that point. Okay, so now, before participating in the discussion, each conflicted community board member discloses their respective conflict. These people then participate in the discussion, and they and there are 23 members of the quorum who do not have conflicts. Now, 23 is an important number. Quorum is maintained at 26 because everybody participated, but here's the math. In a normal, okay, let's just review on voting. If you want something to pass, you need more yes votes than no's or abstentions. So you need a majority of the people at the quorum, which are 26 people normally, to pass this issue, which means with 26 present, normally you'd need 14 yes votes. But remember, 3 people on this issue, three people on this issue cannot vote. They cannot yes, they cannot no, and they cannot abstain. They are not entitled to any of those things. Therefore, there are only 23 people who can vote. And with 23 people, you now need a majority of 23 to pass, which means on this conflicted vote, or rather issue where 3 people have conflicts, you only need 12 yes votes to pass that issue. Now, when the next issue comes up, 26 people are eligible to vote, you're going to need 14 yes votes on the next issue. But for this one, where there are 3 people with conflicts, you need less votes to pass it because you need a majority of the eligible votes to vote yes in order to get to pass the issue. So my slide is totally messed up here. I apologize. This is what happens when you don't check things in the Google slides. I'm so sorry about that. I just got my board membership to MoMA yanked, rightly so. 3 options when you are eligible to vote. You can vote yes, you can vote no, you can abstain. When you are ineligible to vote because you have a conflict of interest, you have 0 options. You can't vote yes, you can't vote no, you cannot abstain. In the record keeping, I would suggest, although this is just a best practices idea, is that because abstention is something that someone who is qualified to vote can do, I would say if someone is ineligible to vote, in the record keeping, you do not say that they abstain, you say did not vote due to conflict of interest, which they disclose, or some other kind of thing which does not confuse this issue, right? We want to make a semantic distinction between abstention, which is something you can do when you are eligible to vote, and then this other thing that you refraining from voting due to conflict of interest, which means you're not abstaining, because abstaining when you're eligible to vote is basically counted with the no's, right? Like if these two things are bigger than the yeses, the thing doesn't pass. You're not allowed to do that when you're ineligible to vote. Okay, enough talk. All right. If you got questions, hit me up in the chat up top. Looks like people are, or not the chat, sorry, the Q&A up top. It looks like people are doing that just fine. Other topics. Okay, let's get away from voting now. If you've got more voting questions, just put them in the Q&A. Here we go. Okay. Do you know, oh, hey, so this is, I thought I removed all of these because this file is too big. If you want to know what this absurd video is, you should check out our YouTube channel. But this man may or may not be saying, do you know who I am? Do you know who I am is a question that most of the time, in almost every instance, does not go well. It does never go the way people think it will go in that moment. And that is why it is best used with your inside your head voice. What I am sort of glibly saying is that one way that the conflict of interest law covers all of us, irrespective of whether we're a community board member or a full-time person like myself, is misuse of position. We're not supposed to use our city title, our city power, our city rank to procure any special benefits for ourselves or anyone with whom we are associated. So saying to someone, hey, I'm a community board member, let me park there. I'm sure you wouldn't do that, but just I'm trying to come up with examples, is a violation of the law. Hey, I'm a member of the COIB. You can't arrest me. That's not going to work, right? Probably would get arrested quicker. But in any case, I'm not allowed to use my city position to try to get a special benefit for myself. So if I've got business cards or my title as a community board member, or I've got a community board email address, I use those things for community board business. I don't use it for outside interests. I don't use it for subscribing to my personal favorite blogs or my Amazon shopping or my dating services, which I don't participate in, but none of those things, right? Public servants should not use or appear to use their positions for private financial advantage of themselves or associates. Okay, so that's pretty simple. One additional thing, just, I don't think I have a slide on this, but it's a question that comes up sometimes is, this isn't really a conflict of interest board question, but it is a question that people ask in these presentations, and sometimes they ask it of Adele, and Adele might be able to speak to this better than me, but there's a little bit like the community board is a body. And so I, as a community board member, am entitled to my opinion, but I may not be entitled to say that my opinion is what the community board thinks. So to the extent that the community board has a public opinion on a thing, when it makes a decision, it should speak with one voice. And when I've got a different opinion, I should make it clear that I've got my own opinion, but it's not necessarily the opinion of the board. And how, I'm not sure how that should be worked out on a community board level, but that's just a good, thing for optics and for the community to understand, when someone is saying something. Is the agency saying it? Are they saying it? Okay. Let's get to something that is covered in the conflict of interest law, which is gifts. The conflict of interest law, if you work for city government, you know that basically we full-time public servants are not allowed to accept gifts from anybody doing business with any part of any city agency anywhere. I don't take gifts from people doing business with DOT. I don't take gifts from people doing business with NYPD. I don't take gifts. I don't take gifts. I can take a gift from my spouse. I can take a gift from my relatives. I can take a gift from some old college roommate of mine who lives in Alaska for my birthday. I don't take gifts from people doing business with a city who I don't know. Now, you're a community board member. You have relationships in the community, and it would be a really weird standard to set for you where you said, well, look, I'm a volunteer member of a community board, so my outside life, you're all dead to me. You know, don't give me a gift for my birthday. Don't even think about it, you corrupt person. That would be a weird standard. So I'm going to formulate what I think is the right answer here for you, community board members. Gifts that are offered to you because you are a community board member should be refused. I don't really care what they are. I don't care if they're under 50 or over 50. If you're being offered, I mean, nobody cares about a tchotchke, right? Nobody cares about a cup of coffee. Nobody cares about a calendar that's got a company logo on it, you know, the other kind of tchotchke, swag, whatever. But generally, when someone is trying to hook me up because I am a community board member, and that's the only reason they're trying to hook me up, I should not take those things. Generally, those things are nicer than $50 anyway. I could regale you with a couple of illegal gift stories from community board members. There was one, boy, I'm going to get the, Adele, what was the name of the club? It was the Sex and the City.
Soho House.
The Soho House. There was actually, and there are very few community board gifts cases, but this is one, and it was in Manhattan, so this is germane to our conversation today. A community board member was fined by the Conflict of Interest Board because she accepted membership in this fairly desirable club, the Soho House, which I didn't know anything about. But basically, she got membership in that club for a couple of years, free membership that cost thousands of dollars because she was a community board member. That was an illegal gift. Now, let's talk about two examples that are a little less or a little more quotidian. One example that's clearly got to be okay, and one example that's probably problematic under the law. What's probably okay? One's a new community board member. For a long time, he's been a regular at Dino's, a bar in his neighborhood. Occasionally, the bartender buys one around. The bartender's always bought one around. Why? Because it's Friday, or because it's the third round, or whatever. This is a practice bartenders do, not because they like you, but because they want more tips. This one isn't being singled out for his board service. He can continue to get free dessert on his birthday or get comped an occasional round. Nobody cares about that. That's a function of being a human at a bar, and those practices will continue. Now, let's look at a slightly different case. Juan receives an invitation for a free dinner at the North Star, a new eatery in the neighborhood, seeking a liquor license. Juan's never been to the North Star. The North Star is addressing it to him, saying, hey, come for a yummy fact-finding mission. You'll see why we deserve to have a liquor license because the food's just that good, blah, blah, blah. Juan should not take that free dinner. He's being offered it because of his community board service. He can go to the eatery and he can pay his own way, but he should not be receiving that kind of a benefit which he's being offered because he is a community board member. Okay. Let's now do, if you have other questions about gifts, just go to the Q&A up top. I'm going to keep moving. We got to keep moving. Okay. Representing private clients, completely different area of the law. I'm speaking to everyone, but I'm thinking primarily of those of you who might be architects, lawyers, accountants, engineers, people who work at firms or who own firms, partners at firms. Okay. As we said before, when you're a community board member, you're always the community board member. It would be really weird if, like, you're a community board member and then all of a sudden your private client shows up and you're like, hey, everybody, hold on. Let me just take off this hat. I'm now going to dance over here and I'm going to represent my client. That's going to be very strange because at some point you, the community board member, are going to want to ask that rep a question. Now you're talking to yourself like, hey, what do you think? Oh, let me explain myself. No, you have to be a community board member. So you cannot represent your clients before the board. You would use the 3Ds. If your client came in on any matter, you're financially associated with that person, so you would disclose. You'd say, hey, that's my client. I do their will. I did their taxes last year, whatever. Then you participate in the discussion, and then you do not vote on the thing. Now, last point here. Let's say I am the partner at a firm. I'm a partner at a law firm. If my firm wants to represent my client, or this client, who might normally be my client, or at least he's a client of my firm cannot do that either unless I get a waiver from the board. A waiver would be readily available in this case, but the waiver basically puts up a wall between my actions as a community board member and the firm's work representing the client. Because I'm associated with the firm, they erect a wall there, and that way I don't work on anything related to that matter, and I certainly don't represent the client. So a waiver is needed in that instance. That's a kind of standard waiver a community board member would get, but basically it shows the public that a wall has been created so that there's a protection from any sort of question that outside interests are being served in the board's actions. Now, example. Sally is a community board member, also a partner in a law firm. Her firm wishes to represent a client on a zoning matter before Sally's community board. I basically just over-explained the last slide. This is the classic example where Sally needs a waiver. The firm that, once Sally gets the waiver, the firm is free to represent the client before the board, and Sally just uses the 3Ds. She discloses, she discusses, and she does not vote. So she takes the steps. She gets a waiver. She uses the 3Ds. She doesn't represent the client before the community board. How does she get a waiver? I thought I had a little graphic of our website. I might be later, but basically, if you community board members need a waiver, it's very easy to get the ball rolling on our website. You'll go to nyc.gov/ethics. I'll give you the info at the end. And there's a button there very prominently displayed that says get a waiver. You just fill out a couple of questions on that form. It will generate an email that comes to us, and we will get the process going for you to get a waiver. And a waiver like Sally's is fairly easy to come by as long as it's credible factually that Sally is able to keep that wall in place. Okay. Okay, now, community board staff. This is pretty easy. This is also another topic. Basically, the conflict of interest law says that I'm not allowed to enter into a financial relationship with anybody above me or below me in the chain of command. So my boss cannot hit me up for a loan. My boss cannot lend money to me. My boss cannot move into my apartment. I cannot move into his apartment, which is good. Basically, for you, what that means is the community board staff that serves the board are considered to be your subordinates because you have some supervisory, evaluative power over those people, and therefore you don't get into a financial relationship. Like, let's say, for example, you as a community board member were an attorney, and you had a community board staffer that needed some help with a closing or a will. You can't be their attorney, even for free. That's considered a financial relationship, and they're subordinate to you. Also, while you can be politically active as a community board member, you can't solicit the board staff. So even if you've got a board staff or a district manager and you know that that person is going to vote for the same candidate as you, you can't hand them a flyer. You can't ask them to go to a rally. You can't ask them for fundraising for a political candidate. The other thing about board staff is close relatives of community board members may not serve as community board staff. So my wife, my kids, my siblings cannot be community board staff. Why? Because I'm a community board member, and I, as a community board member, may be called upon to evaluate that staff at some point. Those people are not allowed to be appointed to serve community board staff. Okay, almost done. Last topic, big topic, because of the way that recently community boards have gotten money from the city. This used to not be an issue that we talked about very much, but now it's very important. That's why I kind of saved it for one of the last ones. So stick with me here. This is an important one. I'm not allowed to do business with the community board where I serve. So for example, I can't sell goods or services to the community board. I could donate things, but I can't sell goods or services to the board. Now, if the board really wants something and I'm willing to give it for cost and it's just such an incredible deal, you can ask on a legal advice call if the deal really is just too good to be true, if maybe they'd entertain a waiver. But really the restriction is pretty ironclad here. I'm not sure if the board would or not, but maybe there's some instance where a waiver would be entertained. It's not very likely. You can't sell goods or services to the board. You also can't represent the board as an attorney. Pro bono representation might be a different story. Again, maybe that's waivable, maybe not, but you'd have to ask for a waiver. Now, receiving reimbursements for expenses. So let's say I've got a thing I'm doing and then I go ahead and spend a lot of money for a community board event and then I just ask for money from the community board to get reimbursed for those expenses. That's doing business with the community board. That's going to be problematic too. Again, you could ask us if there really is some sweet deal where it's just undeniable the public benefit and there's really no appearance issue. Maybe the board would grant a waiver, but don't do this without getting a waiver. And I don't know how often those waivers are entertained, waiver requests are entertained. And receiving grants directly from the community board. So any of these are going to present a problem. Now, I'm not talking about when the community board says, we recommend that another agency spend money on this thing. That's you just use the 3 Ds on. But when the community board says, we've got money and we want to give it directly to this thing, and that's your thing, that's going to be problematic. You really need to talk to us before you do that. And like I said, waivers of this sort are rare. No one gets penalized for asking that question, but it's very rare that that's going to be entertained. Okay, so doing business with the community board, and because community boards have some money to give now, this is increasingly a thing that might come up. Please be careful. Please talk to us if you're thinking about that. Even if everyone thinks it's the best idea in the world, it probably needs to be scrutinized through the waiver process. Okay, so I think a community board member is generally going to need a waiver in these 2 instances, seeking to do business with the community board directly, or if your outside firm where you're a partner or that you own is going to represent or wants to represent a client before the community board. This is the 2 areas. This kind of waiver, kind of rare. This kind of waiver happens with some more frequency. We've seen a lot more of those over the years. Okay, not a lot more. So, we haven't seen a whole lot of waivers in general from community boards, but this one is more has been more frequent than this one. I should say that. I don't make it sound like it happens all the time because I don't think people ask that very often. Okay, here's the slide I was talking about. So this is what the get a waiver page looks like. This is really no nonsense, but that's good. You'll just on our homepage there'll be a sidebar. It says get a waiver will be one of the buttons and it takes you to this thing. This form will take you probably 5-10 minutes to fill out, and then we'll follow up with you if we need any more information to get your waiver request going. Okay, and now last topic, job seeking. This is probably not going to be a thing that comes up for you as a community board member, but I want to put it out there anyway because it is something that you would have to comply with. None of us who have city positions, even as community board members, are allowed to discuss future employment with a firm we're currently dealing with in our city work. So as a community board member, what does this mean? Example, Veronica, who obviously, boy, not an English professor. Actually, she didn't write the question. I wrote the question. All right. Veronica, a professor of architecture, is a community board member on the zoning committee. Columbia University currently has a matter for vote before the zoning committee. Veronica would like to apply for a tenure track position at Columbia's School of Architecture. Okay. Obviously, applying to be a full-time tenure track professor is not something that happens overnight, right? It probably takes, there's a lot of meetings, there's a lot of back and forth. So during this consideration process, while Veronica has really got this iron in the fire, like she's talking to Columbia, they're talking to her, if something comes up that's a Columbia related matter, she uses the 3Ds. She doesn't, she's free to discuss, but she's got to disclose, hey, I'm in talks with them to become a professor at Columbia. Therefore, I'm not going to vote on this thing, but I'm going to participate in the discussion. You can't do both at the same time. You can't be in discussions to be a professor at Columbia and also vote on Columbia's matter. You can't. So you either use the 3Ds on Columbia's matter. That's probably the easiest thing to do. Or you suspend your negotiations on this professorship until the vote is over. Using the 3Ds is probably easier. But that's what this restriction means, basically. And then the other thing that comes up, and this is probably for those professionals, attorneys, accountants, lawyers, engineers, architects to think about, is once you leave board service, you can come back to a public meeting and talk like any other private citizen, but you can't represent a private client for compensation back to the community board for a year. So let's say somebody needs a zoning thing and they want to hire you to go talk about the zoning thing to the community board. You can talk to other community boards, but you can't talk to the community board where you served for 1 year. This is a revolving door restriction, very common in government, where you have to basically cool off and not speak to the agency that you served for 1 year after leaving government service. Okay, and for you, what that means is you just don't talk to the community board for 1 year. You can talk to the borough president's office. You can talk to other community boards. You can't represent a private client. Again, it's a compensated communication by phone, email, or in person, or by mail, anything. You can't make a compensated communication to your former community board. Okay, questions about that? Hit me up in the Q&A. Example, this is a real life example. We've never had a community board post-employment case, so I just picked a different one. A Department of Finance Director of Audits. He left city service to work for a private tax consultancy. Great fit, right? He knows everything about taxes. Within 1 year of leaving, 8 different times he represented private clients back to his former agency, and the result was a $5,000 fine, which he paid in a settlement with us. Okay, we're basically at the end here. So before I leave you with the exit card, which is how to get a hold of us, let's get to this Q&A. It looks like we've definitely got some questions. I want to just, your expectations here, I want to control them a little bit. There may be questions where either I do not know the answer, and I'm going to say that's a great legal advice question. There may be questions where I know the answer, and I'm going to say you should still ask that question by legal advice so they give you an official answer. And there may be questions where I go, I don't know. Adele, do you know? Because I don't think that's a Chapter 68 issue. So, but let me see what I can answer. Here we go. I have to, let's see, and let me get to the, how do I get to the Q&A here? I think I do this. There we go. Okay. Okay, here we go. The first question comes from Colin Mahoney, and it is advocating for tax policy defined as financial interest? That is a great question, and I think I can answer it. And the question is this, or the answer is this. The answer is that generally, general policy advocacy, like there should be more recycling, or there should be higher taxes, or there should be lower taxes, or I think in general businesses pay too much tax in New York City. That is not direct enough of an issue to cause one to have to use the 3Ds. Now, let me do a counterexample and say, or here's one, like, I think I'm bringing this is going to make me sound so old, right? But I'm bringing it up probably because I wrote a hypothetical based on this when it seemed more interesting, was the smoking ban. could a bar owner bring up in general, like, I think the smoking ban's terrible, it's going to be bad for business? Yeah, they can do that. And voting on the smoking ban in general, I don't think is a direct enough thing for one bar owner. Now, voting on something related to, let's say, the one bar owner, because there's still a couple of them out there, right, that have these grandfather licenses on hookahs or whatever, and they're like, my bar's being re-upped on a hookah license, and I think y'all need to support it because where are the smokers going to go? Whatever, I'm making this stuff up. That's an issue where you'd probably have to use the 3Ds. So advocating for tax policy, generally, no. But when you're saying, you know, I need a tax break, it's this thing, I want this thing, and it's really related to me, probably yes. So in the way you've articulated the question, Colin, I think the answer is no. You're not going to have to use the 3Ds in general. So I'm going to go ahead and let that one go. And now I'm going to go to Ricky Wong, who asks, I recently left my city job for the private sector. I know that I'm not allowed to engage in my former city agency, on a formal level for at least a year. Does that also apply now that I'm a community board member? Am I not allowed to contact my former agency as a member of my community board? Hey, that is a great question. And it's a great question because there is actually in the kind of vetted public information that we give on post-employment, this is not one that we have generally answered, I think probably because no one has thought to ask it, but and that's crazy because this law has been around for 30 years. So, but I'll give you what I think the answer is, extrapolating from a very specific provision contained within the post-employment part of the statute. 2604 D6 for you legal nerds out there, I think it's either D6 or D7, says that basically there's a government to government exception. So if I leave the city Department of Finance and I go work for the State Department of Taxation or whatever it's called, I'm allowed to talk to the City Department of Finance the next day because I basically have gone from one sort of public service to another sort of public service. And therefore, there's no private interest involved. So here, one could analogize and say, basically, you're a former city employee. Now you're a different kind of city public servant. That's not a private interest, right? Because if it was a private interest, we wouldn't be talking about this thing because the law wouldn't apply to you. This law applies to public servants. And therefore, basically, it's a government to government exception because there's no private interest here. As a community board member, one would be able to make a communication on behalf of the community board back to the former agency served. Now, there is no formal written opinion that where the board has said that publicly. So, Ricky, if you're the kind of person who likes belts and suspenders, you might write into the board and say, hey, I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this question, but I want some lawyer at the COIB to email me, yes, that's the case, and then I file it away, and if anybody asks the question, I say, here's the answer to that question. Obviously, I can't do that. I'm not an attorney, and I'm also not giving legal advice in this context, in any context, but this is a training. So if you wanted that, Ricky, that's the way you would get it. But I think that's what the answer is you've gone from government to a different kind of government service, and therefore there's no private interest there. Okay, 2 for 2. Okay, third question, Michael Levine. My not-for-profit organization is applying for a street fair permit. I receive no pay for serving on its board. Can I vote on the permit? And the answer to that question is no. Great question, but and Michael, you may have asked this before we got to the slides. It doesn't matter if you did or not, but let's just review that. When I serve on the board of the not-for-profit, I am associated for the purposes of Chapter 68 with the not-for-profit. I'm legally obligated to the not-for-profit by state law, duty of loyalty, duty of care, etc. And therefore, because I'm associated with that not-for-profit by sitting on its board, I am not allowed to vote on an issue that directly affects the not-for-profit. So the street fair permit is a great example. I definitely can participate in the discussions, but I disclose to the community board, hey, I sit on the board of the not-for-profit. This is why I think you should support the permit, but I do not vote because I am associated with that not-for-profit by serving on its board. Okay, Linda, Alexander, wow, like 3 questions came in like the same minute. I wonder what I was saying at that moment. Okay, anyway, when a former client, and that's gonna, I keep repeating that because I'm gonna return to that adjective in a second. When a former client comes before the board, am I obligated to abstain? I have in the past. Okay, I'm going to be a semantic pedantic here and say, when we talk about not being qualified to vote, I don't want to use this word abstain anymore. It's okay if you used it in the past, fine, don't use it anymore. I would reformulate the question because, again, semantic pedantic, and say, if a former client of mine comes before the board, am I obligated to use the 3 Ds? Because remember, abstaining is something you can do when you are qualified to vote. The answer to that is that that turns on the word, or on the idea of former. Okay, I'm going to lay out 3 scenarios. I'm going to lay out like like 2 extremes and 1 in the middle. Here's one extreme. Here's a client who I handled their will last year, 2 years ago. I don't have any expectation that I'm going to see them again, and therefore we're done. There really is no ongoing relationship, and we do not expect there to be one. I think that person, I am not financially associated with that person, so I do not need to use the 3 Ds. Here's another example. I am the attorney for this person constantly, and they are constantly getting sued because they're a real estate developer of questionable repute, and they have lots of debt everywhere and don't pay the persons and parties to whom they are obligated. So I'm constantly representing this person. Now, I've wrapped up my last thing with that client. Given the fact of how often they're sued, probably won't talk to him again for about 2 weeks. I'm not currently associated with him, but that guy goes to me for everything. No, I don't vote on something because I think we all know that everybody in the world, including me and that former client, so to speak, know that I'm probably going to be talking to him again. I might even be on retainer, so all of this is moot anyway. But okay, so that's a different example. In the middle, let's say, the person's come to me for a will. One time he came to me for a tax thing. I don't know if he's going to come to me again or not. I'm not sure if you need to use the 3 Ds or not. I think that the more of an expectation you have that this person is going to come to you with another matter, the more likely it is. But if you've got it, the facts will dictate the answer, and you're going to ask that on a legal advice question if you're in that gray area. But clearly, someone that you're not expecting to have another matter with, just because they were formally associated with you, does not mean you have to use the 3 Ds now. And importantly, Linda, there's no clock on this. So I wrapped the matter with the client last week. We really think it's done. It was an uncomplicated thing. We don't think there's going to be litigation subsequent to this. They're not suing me for malpractice. It really is this thing. It's over. There's no relationship, right? So then the law doesn't say like former client, well, now you got to wait 6 months. It just says you're not associated, right? If you're not associated, you don't have to use the 3 Ds. Okay, so now, Tammy asks the question, again, same minute. Can you address if there is a COIB issue for board members of a not-for-profit organization to vote on any issues of the not-for-profit? Okay, I think because this question came in at the same time that Michael's question came in, I'm going to reiterate it just because it's good to reiterate it. But so if I sit on the board of a not-for-profit, unpaid, then I am associated with the not-for-profit. So when let's say it's an education not-for-profit and the community board wants to grant some money directly to that not-for-profit for an after-school program, I cannot vote on that issue. That is money going to the not-for-profit. I'm associated with not-for-profit because I sit on the board. Now, what if I'm paid by the not-for-profit? Like I'm their paid president or I'm their paid board member, paid executive director. Same answer. I'm their employee. So I'm paid by the not-for-profit. I got to use the 3 Ds because we're voting on something going directly to the not-for-profit that employs me. In either issue, because there's a direct financial thing going, or direct thing, because I think Michael's question was, what about the permit for the outdoor event? Same issue. It's going directly to not-for-profit. I'm associated with the not-for-profit because I sit on the board or I'm employed by them. I use the 3 Ds. I disclose, I discuss, I do not vote. Okay, here we go. Tammy also asked very relevantly, and I'm glad you asked this so we can repeat it. Is a requirement clear that disclosure has to be first before discussion? And the answer is yes. In order for the disclosure to be effective, it has to be before the discussion. And the reason for that is because it just from a very, I mean, the reason why the law is written that way is because if we get to the moment where everyone's participated in the discussion and now we have a vote and now I say, by the way, that's my bar, that's not good faith disclosure to your fellow colleagues in terms of the discussion. So the way the law is structured is no, you disclose up top before you participate in discussion. That way everybody's got the right context for how your remarks may be inflected by your outside interest. Okay. Okay. So thank you, Tammy. Anthony Notaro, when you say do not vote, is that a recusal? That makes a difference in the final vote count. Thanks. You're welcome. And the answer to that is yes. As we said, it does make a difference in the final vote count. When I say do not vote, it means you're not qualified to vote. So again, going from that slide where I said, you know what, it's going to take me too long to go back to it. But basically, 26 people are eligible to vote. If 3 people have conflicts of interest, that means only 23 people are eligible to vote, which means now you only need 12 yes votes to pass that issue because 3 people are not allowed to vote yes, no, vote no, or abstain. They cannot do any of that. So you're only going to count 23 votes on that issue where 3 people have conflicts or whatever number of people. So but that was the example I used. Okay, thank you, Anthony. Jeff Galloway.
Alex?
Yeah, go ahead, Adele.
Compare that to how the vote breaks down if you call it an abstention, because I think people get very confused about that, but it makes a real difference. And as Anthony was pointing out, it affects the vote. Abstentions or no vote. And
okay, yeah, thanks, Adele. That's great. Let me go through that. So I'm going to lay out 2 kind of different sets of facts that are very similar. Here's the first set of facts. First set of facts, and I hope I get the math right on this. Adele, call me on this if I don't quite get it. Here we go. 26 people are there, and let's say we've got 26 people show up and nobody has a conflict. Okay, so we need 14 yes votes to pass, and we've got, it looks like 6 people voted no and 6 people abstained. Right, so the issue then goes nowhere. Or sorry, the issue passes. The issue passes. Okay, so now we've got 3 people have conflict of interest now on the next issue, and let's do it's the same numbers, right? So 3 people have dropped out; they're no longer voting, and so let's say now 14 people vote yes, and now 6 people vote no, and 3 people abstain, right? 3 people abstain, not 6 people, because 3 people are not allowed to vote yes, vote no, or abstain. 3 people abstain. So we've got 6 no's, we've got 3 abstentions, 6 plus 3 is 9, and we've got 14 votes yes, so the thing passes. And actually, they only needed 12 to pass in that issue because the number of yes votes you needed went down. It's 50% plus 1, and only 23 people are eligible to vote. So I feel like my brain is so broken. I can
just to make it clear, yeah. When you're eligible to vote, you're not recusing yourself. You're eligible. An abstention works mathematically as a no.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Thank you for saving me, Adele. Okay, now, if I don't vote, sorry, this is the next question. Jeff Galloway asks, if you don't vote as a result of a conflict, does that affect quorum? The answer is no. Quorum is maintained because everyone still participates in the discussion, I think, but let's read through the rest of Jeff's question. For example, if your presence at the meeting makes the quorum, but without you, there is no quorum. If you don't vote because of a conflict, is quorum lost? The answer is no. Quorum, you've still got quorum. Related question. How is your non-vote recorded? Abstain, recuse, something else. Note that on our CB, an abstention counts as a negative vote. You're the ideal CB. Abstention should be a no vote. That's how, exactly as Adele said. And I would say your non-vote, when you are ineligible to vote and you're not voting yes, you're not voting no, and you're not abstaining, be called something else. Recused because of conflict of interest, ineligible to vote because of conflict of interest, something that lays it out differently. Thank you, Jeff. Michelle Coopersmith. What if I work for a not-for-profit, but I don't know who the donors are? Okay, great question. The answer to that question is the answer to that question is that there are probably very few donors that you have that fund over 10% of the entire budget of the not-for-profit, and you probably know who they are, or it would be easy to find out. And if you are having any trouble finding that out, I'm not saying find out and you're on your own. You call us for legal advice and we'll find out for you if there are any people or entities that fund more than 10% of the entire budget of your not-for-profit. And if there are, we'll put them on a list for you, and that way you'll know that you can't vote on those things. So we'll handle that on the legal advice call. That's what our attorneys do. They will do that work for you. And if there is anybody that you got to use the 3Ds on, they will let you know, and they'll get you that answer quick. Okay, Susan Schwartz asks, what if the not-for-profit is an advocacy group with a specific agenda and the community board member is on the board of that group? Great question. Let me just bring up the one that everyone, maybe this is dated now. Like, I feel like the one everybody either loves to love on or loves to hate on is transportation alternatives. So I'm gonna articulate this in a couple of ways for Susan's question here. Let's say I'm a dues-paying member of the transportation alternatives, largely because I want to do the 5-borough bike tour or the Century Ride or whatever. Being a dues-paying member is not like being an employee of transportation alternatives or being on the board of transportation alternatives. I'm not associated with transportation alternatives by being a dues-paying member. I can vote on anything related to transportation alternatives. Now, what if the community board is now considering putting in more bike lanes in the community area in the district? Transportation Alternatives loves this idea, but they're getting no money from the community board to support this idea. They think it should happen, but there's no direct financial benefit going to Transportation Alternatives as a result of getting another bike lane put in on this specific stretch of road. There's no need to use the 3Ds in that instance. The place where I've got to use the 3Ds is if I'm employed by or sit on the board of the not-for-profit. And the other thing that has to be is there's a direct thing going straight to the not-for-profit, like a street permit or a grant or some other kind of funding stream or something like that, not an advocacy point. Good question, Susan. All right. Adele, how are we doing on time? Are we all right? We don't know.
When are we supposed to finish? 11:30?
I can go as long as you want. I don't want to make people feel like they got to listen to me yap all day. So I'm just sensitive to that. I guess people can hang up when they've had enough of me, and I'll keep.
Exactly. And you haven't lost many, so okay. I think people are pretty engaged.
And even if I lost everyone, I could just keep going, just chatting.
I'll stay.
Pulling my string. All right. So here we go. Betty Kay. This one's for you. If someone is a car owner who relies on free on-the-street parking, can they vote at the community board regarding a bike lane that will remove some parking spaces near their home? In other words, is this a financial interest? And the answer is no, it is not. Unless we're talking about a parking space that only you can use, which, boy, I would love that, because I have to move my, okay, no, I'm okay. The answer is no, it's not direct enough just to you, so you would not have to use the 3Ds on street parking. Plus, if you're like me, you don't know how long you're going to be a car owner. My thing is about to die any day now. So, okay, answered. Nye Whitaker, please clarify when to use abstain and if it counts as a no vote, and the use of present not voting. Okay, I think we've covered this. Abstain is something you can do when you are qualified to vote and you don't have a conflict of interest, because it does count as a no vote. You count the no's with the abstentions and see if it's more or less than the yes votes. I have nothing to say about present but not voting. I would use a more fulsome sort of descriptor if you're talking about someone with a conflict of interest, to say this person was ineligible to vote due to conflict of interest, which they discussed, or some other kind of thing which makes it clear they were complying with Chapter 68. They disclosed their interest. Okay.
Can I say that a few boards do use that present not voting? I've never understood it. I think it's an effort to keep quorum, and but as Alex said, it really should be made more explicit, like why you're not voting.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Nye. Tammy asked another question. Does the same three Ds rule apply for co-chairs? And the answer to that is absolutely. So I'll give just to sort of try to cover the bases on this. Let's say the committee meets and the chair says, I can't be chair of this meeting because I got to use the 3Ds. So co-chair, you got to chair the meeting, and the chair and the co-chair is fine. Except, and so the co-chair runs the meeting, and then we're all good. But let's say the chair of the committee meeting says, "Oh man, issue 1, I got a conflict. I'm going to use the 3Ds." Co-chair, can you chair the meeting for the entire meeting? And the co-chair goes, "No, I can't, because on issue 3, I've got to use the 3Ds, so I can't chair the meeting either. Somebody else is going to have to chair that meeting." You'll figure it out. But if co-chairs got to use the 3Ds just like chairs do, and no one can chair any part of a meeting where they have to use the 3Ds at the meeting. Okay. Mari Moss asks a question. What if there is a chair of a committee who developed a process for the committee to vote or get options of board members before the committee convenes a meeting to vote? Is that ethically sound? Are there any conflicts? Okay. To vote or get opinions of board members before the committee convenes a meeting to vote. I have no opinion on this. There is probably a question. Okay. Also, what if the process was developed and paid for by a local not-for-profit or for-profit organization? Is that a conflict? Okay. So there's a couple of things going on here. Let me do the simpler one, which is the question up top. The Conflict of Interest Board, the Chapter 68 of the City Charter, has nothing to say on the process by which the committees deliberate outside of the conflicts and the voting and that stuff that I've laid out there. So in terms of like how one secures input from fellow board members or committee members in between open meetings is not an issue that ever comes before the Conflict of Interest Board, because it's not covered by our statute. That's not to say that those aren't relevant questions. If people have questions about how to comply with the open meetings law, and to the extent that they can communicate by email in between meetings, which they can, Adele, do you have anything to say about like what a meeting is and what a meeting is not,
Yeah.
and when people can communicate?
Well, people are allowed to, board members are certainly allowed to communicate by phone, by email. You have to be careful if you're all in the same place at the same time, or on a website all together in the real time, that you don't have a quorum, because that becomes a meeting.
Right.
Absent a meeting, there can't be a violation of the open meetings law. There can be, and I've mentioned this to some board members who had questions, you know, a violation of your duty as a board member to listen to the rest of your fellow board members and prejudge issues, but that's not the open meetings law. Usually, it's, you know, taking an actual vote that isn't at a meeting in real time is not a vote. It has no, it has no meaning. Because all under the charter, all actions of boards and committees have to be by a majority vote.
Okay.
Has to take place at a meeting. So this is a kind of, it's a confusing question, and we can address it, but it isn't a conflicts of interest. And I don't know about the second part of it.
Yeah, so the second part is interesting, and I'm not sure how much I could say about it. Like, also, what if the process was developed and paid for by a local not-for-profit or a for-profit organization? Is that a conflict? So that's an interesting question, which, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. And I probably would suggest that maybe anybody who was interested in sort of, you know, paying for services from some entity in order to make something happen, call us for legal advice for the following reason. If I pay a firm for a product, especially if I'm still paying the firm for the product, or whatever this thing is, am I currently financially associated with that firm? And if I am, because I'm the one who paid them or I'm currently paying them, then do I have to use the 3 Ds when an issue comes up for vote? The answer might be yes. It really depends on the way this thing has been paid for and where the funds came from. I think this, there are some interesting questions about this, the second part of Mari's question, where I think probably reaching out to us for legal advice just to make sure that whatever this relationship is with this not-for-profit or for-profit organization can happen in a way that doesn't appear to create some sort of influence or in some way create a question of compliance with the conflict of interest law. I'm not saying that it has here, but because it's a very interesting question that I haven't actually seen come up before, I'd suggest that person write in for legal advice just to cover all the bases. Can I recuse? One way to think about, one term you could use if a person is ineligible for voting is recused from voting, after disclosing conflict, or whatever. So recuse is a term you could use for this idea of being ineligible to vote. But just remember, recusal means you're not abstaining, so you're not counted in the number of eligible votes. Okay, Colin Mahoney. As a follow-up to my last, we are looking at making recommendations to help small businesses recover past COVID. Good for you. But some of us are small business owners and would obviously benefit from any recovery effort which involves tax policy. Clearly, we can make the proposal, but would we have to recuse? The answer to this question, Colin, is really going to turn on the question on how direct the proposed benefit comes to your business, Colin, and how much it is only to your business. And so I probably would write in on legal advice to get an official determination, but I think it is likely that the board is going to say on a general tax policy issue that affects all of the small businesses in New York, you would be eligible to vote and would not have to use the 3 Ds. The more it's tailor-made to your business or to particular types of business that you own, the answer might be different. So you're going to have to ask that question on legal advice, and then I think the answer will largely be good news, and you don't have to use the 3 Ds. But I just want to make sure that that's the answer. Okay, are waivers permanent? Excellent question. Alita Camp asks the question: are waivers permanent? And the answer is no. Waivers are good for as long as the facts are good. If the facts change, then the waiver may not apply if the facts change enough that there are new facts that fall outside of the original waiver's considerations. So for example, if Chanel, just raise your hand. Chanel, do me a favor and put your question in the Q&A box up top, and I'll get to it as I'm going through this stuff. Alita Camp asked the question, our waiver. So example, I've got a waiver now for my firm to represent this client on this particular matter before the agency now, or before the community board. Now, all of a sudden, our relationship with the client has changed. It's a lot more matters that are coming before the board, and it's a lot more of the business. And now all of a sudden, like, they want me to work behind the scenes on it because there's so much work. I mean, there are facts that could change the waiver and cause one to reapply for the waiver because the facts have altered. If you have a question about that, because you're like, oh, these facts look different, you write back to us and we'll let you know if you need to reapply or if the facts are still good enough for the waiver as stated. The one thing that, Alita, that people do ask is like, do I have to apply for a waiver every year if the facts don't change? And the answer is no. As long as the facts stay the same, you do not need to reapply for a waiver. Okay, Tui Pham, what if a community board member is not a partner, but rather of counsel for a firm? If that of counsel does do no work for that client, is a waiver still needed? Okay. The answer to that question is you're gonna need to write into us on that. I don't have that answer offhand, and I'm sorry, Tweet, for that. Yeah, I don't know the answer off the top of my head. It's pretty clear when you're a partner. If I'm just an employee at the law firm, then I just use the 3 Ds, and of course I don't represent the client, but I don't have to worry about the firm representing the client. But if I'm a partner at the firm, I need the waiver of counsel. Boy, I wish I knew that. I don't know the answer. So Tweet, you got to ask the question of legal advice. That's a pretty straight shot, though. I think that's a quick turnaround, as most of them are. Okay, Will Sanchez asks, if you don't have a waiver and you needed one because you're Sally, then you disclose what? Okay, so Sally, let me go back to Sally because this is the problem of taking the questions at the end. Sorry, guys. 1 second here. Okay. Sally was a community board member, also a partner in a law firm. Her firm wishes to represent a client on a zoning matter before Sally CB. Okay. If you don't have a waiver and you needed one because you're Sally, then I disclose what? Okay. So, okay, so my firm has a client, right? And that client has a matter before the CB. Because I'm a partner at the firm, I'm associated with the client. And therefore, when the client has a matter before the community board, I disclose, hey, that's a client of my firm, then I'm free to discuss, and then I do not vote. Now, let's say separate from that, from the client coming in on whatever matter the client comes in on, the client now wants someone at my firm to represent him or her at the community board meeting. That's the thing that I, Sally, apply for the waiver for, which would be readily granted, but that's the answer. Okay, now, Will follows up, our community board members do discuss, and then it discloses when called to vote on saying the NVFC, sometimes stating the reason for the cause. Is this a problem or an alternate way? Okay. Adele, I'm just showing the world how stupid I am. What's
No,
NVFC?
I think that's a problem. Alex, you've been really clear that you before you discuss, you want to disclose so that people are informed when they listen to you about what
Yeah.
your biases may be. So I would say that they should do it the way you've described, which is disclose is the first D and discuss is the second. Because then, you know, people know, as I said, when they listen to you, why you have recused yourself and are not voting. But they still might be persuaded by your, and you don't know which side you're gonna, you know, the person's gonna come down on. It's the relationship that requires your disclosure and not voting.
Um,
That makes sense?
okay, that makes sense to me. Thank you, Adele. Susan, does the board member who is disclosing have to disclose each time there's a discussion? Yes. I'm reminded. I don't know why that question makes me. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old who's learning so much from the 3-year-old, and somehow this question reminds me of so many situations with him where it's like, I told you yesterday I was doing the thing. Okay, that was yesterday, right? So if you got to disclose because the vote, something's coming up for discussion again this meeting, like it did last meeting, and now the vote's coming up this time, yeah, you should disclose again when you participate in the discussion. Susan asked this in good faith, so I don't want to be too glib about it, but just saying like, I told you guys 6 months ago I was the bar owner, like that's not the ideal way that should happen, right? If the spirit is of, the discussion should have the good context, so we understand the frame of the right framing of the remarks, then we should disclose when the conflict comes up in whatever discussion it comes up in. Good question, though. Okay, Michael Noble, what happens to the community chair who has had 3 conflicts during the course of a year? Does he remain as chair or must he be replaced? And the answer to that is, Michael Noble asked this question, is if I'd say we get up to 2 of these places where the committee chair's got to use the 3Ds, I think the committee chair should call us up and say, hey, what do I do? And we'll give them legal advice on this thing. Or let's say 3 times have happened already. I think the committee chair calls us up and says, what should I do? And the answer is largely going to turn on, okay, do we anticipate that number 4 is right or the next one is right around the corner? Actually, what the law says is 3 or more. So I think probably you have this conversation at 2. So we've had 2. And now the committee chair calls us up and says, all right, we talk to him, we say, do you think there's going to be another one? Is it likely? If the likelihood's high, let's go ahead and get this process started now that you're not the committee chair anymore, because that might take some time. I don't know. If we think it's highly unlikely, because, I only own 2 bars, there's probably not another one, I'm not going to have another one, then maybe we're good. And that's why we've written this rule. So 2's not 3 and we're good to go. So call us on legal advice. We'll figure out a reasonable time frame. If it turns out that the answer is that the person needs to not be the committee chair, let's just document we're addressing this problem now. And by this date, we expect this change to happen. We've worked to provide compliance with the law without being unreasonable to anybody. Okay, thank you, Michael. Robert.
Yeah, I have a question, Alex. This clarification is recent, right? And would it apply, and should a board apply it retroactively?
That's an interesting question. I think that anyone who is now in the position where they've already, used the 3Ds 3 times, they should give us a legal advice call now. I will say this, that the board is that this has always been the board's practice, that when a new piece of law comes into play that people are not generally aware of yet, the board does not go out and get a lot of gotcha cases. Like, there's going to be a reasonable amount of time for understanding to grow about this new clarification. And so someone who's in that position where they've already done the 3 times, they should call us for legal advice and we'll work with them so that, there definitely will not be any enforcement cases. Let's just handle this on the advice side so that we can bring the world into compliance with the way the law has slightly changed.
Thank you.
Robert Espier, my position is that board members may communicate among other via email. However, all such communication should be accessible to the entire committee if requested, or if the emailer chooses to share it. Robert, I think the first part of this, as Adele laid out, communicating with a fellow board member by email is not a meeting. I will say this, that, you've probably had trainings with Adele about freedom of information requests. And so, members of the public are allowed to make requests regarding communications that happen on community board issues. That's not a conflict of interest board thing, but, I think that's probably why you all have community board emails, is so that you can conduct that business. And if there is a freedom of information request, you're not then, handing over, your private emails for somebody to figure out whether or not there's community board business in there. Okay. Adele, you want to say anything else about that? You don't have to.
Yeah, unmute. Yeah. Other than being subject to FOIL, as Alex said, emails aren't a meeting. They can be considered private communications. There might be lots of reasons why you wouldn't want it shared. You might be, that Sally was a pain last night sort of comment. They're not meetings, so they're not really open. But they are subject to FOIL.
Okay.
If they're used for community board business.
Thank you. Robert then follows up. In other words, email communication between board members is not proprietary. They could be subject to freedom of information requests. Okay, April. April just said, have to leave, but thank you for the presentation. Very informative. You're welcome, April. Okay, Chanel, waited so long for this. I hope you're still on the call. Okay, so Chanel. Can board members live and work outside of the district they are serving in? That is a question I do not know the answer to. Adele, I assume the answer is no, but that's a borough president's office question about appointments, I think, right?
Yeah, that has to do with that's a very technical question. It has to do with appointments and retention on the board that we can speak to.
Okay, next question. Can community board members use letterhead of the board for their personal initiatives? Okay, the answer to that is that none of us as public servants are allowed to use city letterhead. That is the, thank you, Robert, SPA, he's leaving. Okay, so the answer to your question is, Chanel, that none of us as public servants are allowed to use the city's letterhead for a private purpose. So for example, let's say my friend wanted a character witness recommendation because he is applying for a graduate school. I could write him the recommendation and I could say, hey, I'm a training director with lots of experience. I work in government. But I can't use my city letterhead to do that because that's saying the city's recommending my friend and the city doesn't care about my friend, right? So I don't use city letterhead for a non-city purpose. Anytime one has done that, we see letterhead misuse cases. And so I'd say anyone who has an allegation of a violation because they think something has occurred can write into us on our website or call us and make a confidential complaint saying, I allege this thing has happened. And then the board with its due process will find out what the facts are and then figure out if there's been a violation or not. I don't want to say every instance of use of letterhead is a violation. Obviously that's not true. We have letterhead for official purposes, but people have gotten in trouble for that. Okay. Can community board members falsely advertise that they work for the board on social media? Okay, so my social media account, my private social media account, it should be clear that my opinions are my own. And to the extent that I have an opinion related to my board service, that's okay. But I should make sure that one, while I could put in my bio that one of the many awesome things I've achieved in my life is being a community board member, I shouldn't represent that it's the official account of the community board. It's my own private account, and that happens to be one interesting facet of me. But these are my personal opinions. And so I shouldn't use community board logos, community board seals, community board anything any kind of assets that are generated for the use of the city or the community board social media should not go on my private account, nor should I, let's say there's some executive session that comes up that's not subject to freedom of information laws, that should not be ever shared outside of that executive session. That's confidential information. So I run the social media account for my agency, which is probably why I don't have my own social media account, because it's just too much Twitter, too much of the time. I don't know if I'd be alive. But in any case, if I did have those two different things, I would hew a big distinction between what is official city business and what my personal representations are. Okay, and if someone is mixing those things up, that there might be a violation of the conflict of interest law there. There might not be, but it's definitely something we've taken complaints on. Can community board members harass other community board members and community members? Not a great idea. Not a violation of the conflict of interest law to be a jerk. You know, as Antonin Scalia once said in a dissent, I think, title, I'm going to get this wrong. Adele probably remembers this better than I do. Title VII is not a code of civility. Is that
Right.
the quote?
Yeah, well,
In any case, so the conflict of interest law doesn't say that you have to be nice. Could people do all kinds of things to their fellow community board members that either would cause them to not seem like a good fit for the board and then not get reappointed, or cause their fellow community board members to call the police on them? Probably, but those simply aren't cases that the conflict of interest board has anything to, the law doesn't have anything to say. The conflict of interest law doesn't have anything to say about that. Can board members serve on a campaign for a staff member of the BP office running for office, and that office allow unauthorized behavior of the board member that other board members were removed for because of political favor? Okay, so the second part of this question is really a little, I mean, it sounds like an allegation of something, and people who have allegations of kind of misuse of position, they should write into the board, and that's, I mean, that's what that's for, right? And I don't want to say here that the allegation that's being made here is true or not, or has merit. I have no idea, but those are, these concerns are why you have an enforcement unit. Now, the first part of it, can board members serve on the campaign for a staff member of the BP office running for office? The answer to that question is that any community board member is allowed to engage in political activity. They can raise money, they can volunteer their time, they can write checks, they can write to anybody. In the same way that if I work for the borough president, I could volunteer to be on her re-election campaign, and I could write checks out of my own account. I mean, not this borough president, I think Gail's termed, right? But in any case, it doesn't matter. The important point is that if I'm a city council staffer, I can volunteer for my boss's campaign, right? I have free speech rights. So there's no prohibition in the conflict of interest law that prevents a community board member from volunteering for whatever campaign they would like to volunteer for. Anyway, sorry, there was a couple. Chanel's got some other good questions. I want to just say that this last political thing, the easy answer is we all can volunteer for whatever campaign that we want. The harder one is sort of allegations of like people misusing their position or doing something else to affect the work of the community board or whatever. Those are serious allegations, and they should be, if people want to know where an allegation should be made, they should be made to us. Now, one thing Chanel also wants just repeated is, repeat the answer for the live and work question. Adele, I think the answer is, if there's a question about whether or not one has to live in the district where they serve as a community board member, that should be addressed to you guys offline. Is that correct?
Yes, you have to either live in the district or have a significant interest in the district, and the definition of significant interest has been really elucidated on by Corporation Counsel, and we have lots of information on that we could deal with.
Okay.
I do want to point out there's a question in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Sorry. Question in the chat. Thank you. Let me open up that chat.
From Susan Schwartz. I think it's a pretty easy answer.
Okay, Susan, I'm just looking for your question. Susan Schwartz, all panels. Would an employee of a not-for-profit like Lisa Orman of Streets Blog and TA be eligible to be a community board member, to be a member of a CB? Okay, so the answer, I don't want to speculate on anyone specifically, so let me just lay out a direct answer that sort of speaks to the fact pattern without implicating Lisa Orman specifically, which is that the conflict of interest law anticipates that employees of not-for-profits or board members of not-for-profits indeed will be community board members, and that's why there's a restriction on when they can vote. So the answer is there's nothing in the conflict of interest law that prohibits an employee of TA or employee of any not-for-profit being a community board member. There just may be issues where they're precluded from voting, as we've talked about today. Adele, do you have anything else you want to say about that?
Yeah, I assume community member means public member.
Oh, okay. Public
I don't know. And that, of course, is there are no rules for who can be a public member. It's completely at the discretion of the chair.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. That's, Susan,
I'm not sure if that's what you meant.
Yeah, so a public member of a community board is not entitled to vote on anything. They largely serve there to provide valuable input that, Susan, you might not think the input's valuable depending on the public member, but that's what they're there for, is they've got some expertise in some issues. So they're gonna talk about stuff. They're not bound by the conflict of interest law because they can't vote, right? And so the conflict of interest law doesn't have anything to say about who can be one or not be one. It's just not contained within Chapter 68. And it sounds like it's, Adele gave you the answer there. It's at the discretion of the chair. Okay. Okay, no problem. Okay, friends, I think that we've gotten through, let me make sure I've gotten through everything. All the questions have been asked. All the questions have been answered. Public member, oh, here's one. Michael Noble asks, can public members can vote on committees, right? I actually don't know the answer to that.
Yes, they can.
Okay,
Yeah.
They can vote on committees.
On the committee to which, when a public member is appointed, they're basically appointed to serve on a committee. And as you said, because of their special interest or whatever the chair thinks, they can't vote in full board, of course.
Okay, got it. Okay, Tammy asks this question: if public members count towards quorum, then should they follow the 3 Ds because they vote on committees? Excellent question. And to answer that question, I need to go to...
I think they do count as quorum because they're official members of subcommittees, I'm pretty sure, but on the committee meeting quorum. Does that make sense?
That does make sense because they're going to vote. So how could they not count for the quorum? Yeah. Okay. For purposes.
Here it is. You got it. Yeah.
Public members. A public member of a community board committee is not a public servant within the meaning of Charter Section 2601(19). So it's a really interesting question that Tammy is asking, where it kind of feels like, shouldn't they use the 3 Ds? Because otherwise they're going to affect the vote on interests. And I don't think that anything in the board rules specifically address that. So I'm going to need to follow up with Adele on that and see what the answer is. That's an outlying question that I cannot answer here. But I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Tammy, is Adele and I will work together to get an answer on that question, okay? Thank you for asking.
Tammy. Thank you, Tammy.
Okay, other questions? I think if Okay. And Tammy asks like if they're not required to follow through these by city rules, can the CB itself require it? I don't know. I'm gonna go talk to my community board legal advice guru and see what he has to say. Go talk to him means I will sit here and email him when I'm done talking with you all. Okay. Okay. So friends, I think we're at the end of our time together. So I thank you for sticking with it on the long haul. Happy that it went that long, and always such great questions in Manhattan. So Aldel, you want to say anything else to?
I just want to thank you as always, Alex. You guys are such a fantastic resource
We're happy to
for
do
the
it.
city, and and you in particular.
We are happy to do it, and so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. There we go.